The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the pristine lawn as Mr. Singh adjusted the new grill on his back patio. The excitement in the air was palpable. His youngest daughter had just received her acceptance letter to medical school, and this BBQ would be the perfect way to celebrate with the whole family. He couldn't help but smile as he remembered the moment she burst into his home office, tears of joy streaming down her face, waving the acceptance letter like a victory flag. As he marinated the chicken for the grill, his wife bustled around the kitchen, the familiar scent of her secret recipe spices filling the air. Their oldest son was setting up tables and chairs in the backyard, while their daughter decorated with strings of lights that would twinkle beautifully once the sun set. The whole scene looked like something out of a magazine, perfect for the celebration they had planned. Throughout the morning, relatives began arriving from all corners of the country. Uncle Ram and Aunt Priya had driven 6 hours from Chicago, their minivan packed with homemade sweets. Cousins flew in from Boston and Seattle, and even their 80-year-old grandmother had made the trip from San Francisco, determined not to miss this special occasion. The driveway slowly filled with cars, and the sound of laughter and excited greetings echoed through the normally quiet suburban street. Mr. Singh hadn't told many of his neighbors about his position on the city council or his role chairing several community development committees. He preferred to keep a low profile, believing that actions spoke louder than titles. Over the years, he had quietly helped shape the neighborhood's growth, approved renovation permits, and worked to make their community more inclusive. His colleagues at City Hall knew him as a bridge builder, someone who could bring different groups together and find common ground in even the most heated disputes. The BBQ preparations were coming along nicely. The tables were laden with colorful salads, fresh fruits, and appetizers that represented their family's blend of traditional Indian cuisine and American classics. The mouth-watering aroma of grilling food began to waft through the air, and children chased each other around the yard, their happy shrieks mixing with the background music playing softly through outdoor speakers. Mr. Singh's wife had just finished arranging her famous mango lassi on the beverage table when she noticed their new neighbor watching from across the street. The woman had moved in just 3 months ago, and despite several friendly waves and attempts at conversation, she had remained oddly distant. Now she stood at her mailbox, phone in hand, with an expression that didn't look particularly neighborly. "Maybe we should invite her over," Mrs. Singh suggested, always the optimist. "It might be a good chance to finally break the ice." Mr. Singh nodded thoughtfully, remembering how he had helped approve this very neighbor's daughter's zoning request for a home business just last month, though they had never met in person. He believed in the power of food and celebration to bring people together, to break down the barriers that sometimes existed between neighbors. Little did he know that this afternoon would put his diplomatic skills to the ultimate test. As more guests arrived, the atmosphere grew increasingly festive. Friends from the local community center, colleagues from the hospital where their daughter had volunteered, and several of Mr. Singh's fellow city council members joined the celebration. The mix of people reflected the diverse, vibrant community they had helped build over the years: doctors, teachers, small business owners, and public servants, all coming together to celebrate a young woman's achievement. The sun continued its slow descent, and the streetlights began to twinkle in the growing dusk. The scene was perfect, almost too perfect. And as Mr. Singh watched his new neighbor's growing agitation from the corner of his eye, he couldn't shake the feeling that this celebration was about to become much more than just a family BBQ. It would become a moment that would test everything he believed about community, understanding, and the power of bringing people together. The pleasant afternoon took an uncomfortable turn as Mrs. Lee, the neighbor from across the street, began pacing back and forth on her front lawn. Her actions became increasingly obvious, taking photos of the parked cars, counting the number of guests entering the Singh family's home, and making what appeared to be frustrated phone calls. "Look at all these people," she muttered loud enough for nearby guests to hear. This used to be such a nice, quiet neighborhood. She tapped aggressively on her phone screen, glancing up every few seconds to survey the scene with disapproval written across her face. The celebration continued inside the Singh's backyard, though some guests had started to notice the neighbor's strange behavior. Mr. Singh's sister-in-law, a kindergarten teacher with a particular talent for reading people, watched with concern as Mrs. Lee's agitation seemed to grow with each new arrival. "Just ignore her," whispered one of the cousins, passing by with a plate of grilled vegetables. "This is a happy day. Don't let her ruin it." But the tension was becoming harder to ignore as Mrs. Lee's voice carried over the fence, her complaints about these people and neighborhood standards becoming more pointed and less subtle. The children, who had been playing a spirited game of tag, gradually moved their activities closer to the house, sensing the adults' unease. Mr. Singh's daughter, the guest of honor, tried to keep the mood light by sharing funny stories from her medical school interviews, but her eyes kept drifting to the fence where Mrs. Lee's shadow would appear and disappear. "Maybe she's just having a bad day," suggested Mr. Singh's wife optimistically, though her smile didn't quite reach her eyes. She busied herself rearranging the dessert table, adding more plates of her homemade sweets that had always managed to win over even the grumpiest of neighbors in the past. The situation grew more tense when Mrs. Lee began taking videos of the gathering, making no attempt to hide her actions. She walked along the sidewalk, phone held high, narrating loudly about property values and excessive noise. Several guests shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others suggested calling the police themselves to report harassment. Mr. Singh's oldest son, usually quick to stand up against any slight, looked to his father for guidance. The younger man's hands were clenched at his sides, but his father's calm demeanor kept him in check. Years of watching his father handle difficult situations at community meetings had taught him that sometimes the strongest response was a measured one. "Dad, you can't just let her," he started, but Mr. Singh raised his hand gently. "Let's see how this plays out," Mr. Singh said quietly, his eyes showing not anger but a mix of determination and something that looked almost like compassion. He had dealt with similar situations throughout his career on the city council, though never quite so close to home. The party continued, with guests making a visible effort to enjoy themselves despite the unwanted attention. The food was delicious, the music was perfect, and the occasion was still worth celebrating. Yet there was an undercurrent of tension, like a storm cloud threatening a sunny day. Mrs. Lee's behavior was building to something. Everyone could feel it. She had moved from taking pictures to making what appeared to be official-looking notes on a clipboard she'd retrieved from her house. Her body language suggested she was preparing for a confrontation, and the question wasn't if she would approach, but when. As the afternoon wore on, some of the older guests began sharing knowing looks. They'd seen this kind of behavior before in different times and places, but the younger generation, including Mr. Singh's children, were visibly struggling to maintain their composure in the face of such blatant hostility. Little did Mrs. Lee know that her next actions would not only reveal her own prejudices, but would also unveil a side of her quiet neighbor that would leave the entire street talking for months to come. The stage was set for a confrontation that would either tear their community apart or, perhaps, bring it together in ways no one could have predicted. The pleasant chatter at the BBQ celebration came to an abrupt halt as Mrs. Lee marched purposefully through the side gate into the Singh's backyard. A folder was clutched tightly in her hands, and her face was set with grim determination. The children, who had been playing near the swings, quickly scampered back to their parents. "I need to speak to whoever's in charge here," she announced loudly, her voice cutting through the music playing softly in the background. All eyes turned to Mr. Singh, who was standing by the grill, spatula in hand. "That would be me," he replied calmly, placing the spatula down and wiping his hands on his apron. "How can I help you?" Mrs. Lee thrust the folder forward. "Do you have permits for this public gathering? There are noise ordinances in this neighborhood and parking restrictions. I've counted at least 20 cars that don't belong here." One of the guests, a police officer who had worked with Mr. Singh on community safety programs, started to stand up, but Mr. Singh gave him a supple shake of the head. The officer sat back down, though his expression remained concerned. "This is a private family celebration," Mr. Singh explained patiently. "My daughter was accepted into medical school, and our family has come together to celebrate her achievement." Mrs. Lee's lips tightened. "Well, there are too many people here. This isn't that kind of neighborhood. We have standards to maintain." Her emphasis on certain words made several guests shift uncomfortably in their seats. A tense silence fell over the gathering. The only sounds were the sizzling of food on the grill and the distant laughter of children who had retreated to the front yard. Mr. Singh's wife stood nearby, her hands clasped tightly together, watching the scene unfold. I've already called the authorities, Mrs. Lee continued, her voice rising. They'll be here soon to check if everything is legal. She glanced around at the decorations and food tables with obvious disapproval. People in this neighborhood work hard to keep their property values up. We can't have this kind of activity bringing down the whole street. Mr. Singh's daughter, the guest of honor, stepped forward. Ma'am, this is just a family party. We're not doing anything wrong. Mrs. Lee turned sharply toward her. And how many family members are we talking about exactly? Because I've been watching, and people have been arriving all day. This isn't a community center, you know. The racist undertones of her comments hung heavy in the air. Several guests began gathering their belongings, not wanting their children to witness the confrontation. Mr. Singh's son clenched his fists, but his father's steady presence kept him from responding. Mrs. Lee, Mr. Singh said quietly, "Why don't you join us? There's plenty of food, and you might find that we have more in common than you think." His unexpected invitation caught her off guard, but before she could respond, the sound of a police car pulling up out front drew everyone's attention. Mrs. Lee's face lit up with satisfaction. "Finally," she said, "now we'll get this sorted out properly." What happened next would leave Mrs. Lee speechless. As two police officers walked into the backyard, broad smiles spread across their faces. Mr. Singh called out the first officer warmly. "We got a complaint about a party, but I should have known it was your famous family BBQ. Is there any of your wife's amazing mango lassi left?" Mrs. Lee's expression shifted from triumphant to confused as she watched the officers greet not only Mr. Singh, but several other guests by name. She couldn't understand why the police weren't taking her complaints seriously. Little did she know, the biggest surprise was yet to come, one that would make her regret every assumption she had made about her quiet neighbor. Mrs. Lee stood frozen in disbelief as she watched the police officers casually accept plates of food from Mr. Singh's wife. Her complaint about the gathering had backfired spectacularly, and now she found herself surrounded by guests who were trying hard not to smile at her obvious discomfort. But the noise ordinances, she sputtered, flipping through her folder of printed regulations. And the parking violations. Surely you're not just going to ignore all of that. The older police officer, finishing a bite of grilled chicken, shook his head. "Ma'am, this is a private family gathering. They're well within their rights, and honestly, this is one of the most orderly celebrations I've seen in my 20 years on the force." His younger partner nodded in agreement. Plus, Mr. Singh here has helped organize half the community events in this city. Remember that food drive last winter? That was all his doing. Mrs. Lee's face flushed red as she realized her carefully planned intervention was falling apart. She looked around the backyard again, but this time with different eyes. She noticed the perfectly maintained garden, the tasteful decorations, the well-behaved children, and the professional-looking guests, doctors, teachers, and what appeared to be other civil servants. "I don't understand," she said, her voice smaller now. "You all know each other?" Mr. Singh stepped forward, still wearing his world's best dad apron. "Mrs. Lee, would you like to sit down? I think there are some things we should discuss." He gestured to an empty chair at a nearby table. For a moment, it looked like she might refuse. Her body language was stiff, defensive, like a cornered animal looking for escape. But something in Mr. Singh's gentle demeanor made her hesitate. The older police officer touched his hat in a friendly salute. "We'll be heading out now, Mr. Singh. Congratulations to your daughter on medical school. My wife will be dropping by later with her famous apple pie." As the officers left, Mrs. Lee slowly sank into the offered chair. Mr. Singh's wife immediately brought over a plate of food and a glass of mango lassi, setting them down with a kindness that made Mrs. Lee look even more uncomfortable. "You mentioned property values," Mr. Singh began, taking a seat across from her. "That's actually something I know quite a bit about." He reached for his wallet and pulled out a business card, sliding it across the table. Mrs. Lee picked up the card, her hands trembling slightly. As she read it, her eyes widened and the color drained from her face. The other guests watched with interest as the realization dawned on her. She had just tried to shut down the party of the head of the city's community development board. You're the one who approved my daughter's home business permit last month," she whispered, recognition finally hitting her. "I never met you in person, but your signature was on all the paperwork." Mr. Singh nodded. I thought your name sounded familiar when you moved in. Your daughter's proposal for a home-based art studio was very impressive. I was happy to help push it through the zoning commission. The irony of the situation wasn't lost on anyone present. Several guests exchanged knowing looks, while others tried to hide their amused smiles behind their drinks. But Mr. Singh maintained his dignified composure, treating Mrs. Lee with the same respect he showed everyone. The awkward silence was broken by the arrival of Mr. Singh's youngest son, who innocently offered Mrs. Lee a plate of his mother's freshly made samosas. They're really good, he said with a child's simple honesty. Mom makes the best ones in the whole city. This small gesture, this moment of pure innocence, seemed to break something in Mrs. Lee. She looked at the food, then at the child's hopeful face, then back at Mr. Singh's business card. The weight of her actions, her assumptions, and her prejudices began to crash down around her. With shaking hands, Mrs. Lee set down Mr. Singh's business card on the table. The celebration continued around them, but in their small corner of the backyard, time seemed to stand still. Mr. Singh reached into a nearby briefcase and pulled out a familiar-looking folder, the same one that had crossed his desk just weeks ago. Your daughter's art studio proposal, he said softly, opening the folder. I remember it well because it reminded me of my own daughter's journey. Young people following their dreams, that's what builds strong communities. Mrs. Lee stared at the documents, her earlier confidence completely deflated. The approved permits, the zoning exceptions, and most notably, Mr. Singh's signature at the bottom of each page. All evidence of how he had helped her family without even knowing who they were. I don't understand, she stammered. You helped us even though we had never met. Mr. Singh finished her sentence kindly. That's what neighbors do. When I reviewed the proposal, I saw passion, talent, and potential. That's all that mattered. A young woman approached their table, Mr. Singh's daughter, the one celebrating her medical school acceptance. She carried a photo album and placed it gently on the table. Dad, maybe Mrs. Lee would like to see some pictures from last year's community art fair. The one where you helped set up that special section for young artists. The album was opened to reveal photographs of a vibrant community event. There was Mr. Singh, without any fanfare, helping to hang artwork, arranging refreshments, and talking with young artists about their work. In one photo, he was even fixing a broken easel, his suit jacket off and sleeves rolled up. We have another art fair coming up next month, he mentioned casually. Your daughter's work would be a wonderful addition. The community always benefits from new voices and perspectives. Mrs. Lee's hands trembled as she turned the pages of the photo album. Each image showed a different side of the quiet neighbor she had so quickly judged, leading community cleanup efforts, organizing food drives, mentoring young entrepreneurs. All this time, she whispered, you've been just a neighbor trying to make our community better. Mr. Singh completed her thought. Like your daughter with her art studio. Like my daughter heading to medical school. We're all just trying to build something meaningful. The sound of children laughing drew their attention to where Mr. Singh's youngest son was now playing with Mrs. Lee's daughter, who had wandered into the backyard looking for her mother. The two kids had apparently bonded over their shared love of art, completely unaware of the tension between their parents. They go to the same school, Mr. Singh noted with a smile. Your daughter helped my son with an art project last week. He hasn't stopped talking about it since. Mrs. Lee watched the children play, tears forming in her eyes. The weight of her assumptions, her prejudices, and her actions seemed to crash down all at once. Here was the man she had tried to report, had accused of disrupting the neighborhood, revealing himself to be not just a pillar of the community, but someone who had directly helped her own family. The samosas are getting cold, Mr. Singh's wife said gently, pushing the plate closer to Mrs. Lee. And everyone says they're not as good when they're cold. In that moment, surrounded by the evidence of her misjudgment and faced with nothing but kindness in return, Mrs. Lee reached for a samosa with trembling fingers. It was a small gesture, but in that backyard, on that warm afternoon, it felt like the first step towards something bigger than all of them. The backyard fell into a comfortable silence as Mr. Singh began sharing stories of his years working in community development. Each tale revealed another thread in the fabric of their neighborhood's history, stories Mrs. Lee had never known about the very streets she now called home. Remember the old playground? He asked, speaking to some of the longtime residents who had gathered around their table. "It took us 3 years of fundraising and planning, but seeing the children's faces on opening day made it all worth it." An elderly guest chuckled, adding, "And don't forget about the time you spent 6 weekends helping to repair the community center roof after that big storm." Mrs. Lee listened intently, taking small bites of her samosa. With each story, the image she had constructed of her neighbors crumbled further. The disruption she had complained about was actually a celebration of achievement, of family, of community. "Last winter," Mr. Singh continued, his voice warm with memory, "when that big snowstorm hit, we organized a volunteer group to help clear driveways for elderly residents." He paused, looking thoughtfully at Mrs. Lee. "Actually, I noticed someone had already cleared your mother-in-law's driveway when we got there." Mrs. Lee's eyes widened. "That was you?" "My mother-in-law talked about those volunteers for weeks. She said it was the first time in years she didn't feel alone during a snowstorm." Mr. Singh's teenage son, who had been quietly listening, spoke up. "Dad never tells people when he helps out. He says good deeds speak for themselves." As if to prove the point, more neighbors began sharing their own stories about the quiet ways Mr. Singh and his family had improved their community. The owner of the local bookstore talked about how Mr. Singh had helped her navigate complex zoning laws when she wanted to add a coffee shop. A teacher mentioned the anonymous donation that had funded new computers for her classroom, though everyone knew where it had come from. "But why?" Mrs. Lee finally asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "Why help everyone so much, even people who—" She trailed off, unable to finish the thought. Mr. Singh smiled gently. "Because a community is like a garden. You can't just tend to one flower and expect the whole garden to thrive. Every plant needs care, sunshine, and a chance to grow." His daughter, the medical school student, added, "Dad always says that the true measure of a person isn't how they treat their friends, but how they treat those who might not like them very much." The afternoon light was growing softer, casting long shadows across the lawn. The string lights overhead began to twinkle, creating a warm glow that seemed to soften every face in the gathering. Children's laughter still rang out from the front yard, where Mrs. Lee's daughter was now teaching Mr. Singh's son how to draw with sidewalk chalk. "You know," Mr. Singh's wife said, bringing over a fresh plate of sweets, "sometimes the best friendships start with a misunderstanding. It gives people a chance to really see each other, to move past their first impressions." Mrs. Lee looked down at her empty plate, then at the children playing, and finally at Mr. Singh. "I don't deserve your kindness," she said softly, "after everything I said and did today." But before she could finish, Mr. Singh raised his hand. "The past is like a stepping stone," he said. "We can either stumble over it or use it to move forward. What matters is which choice we make next." The simple wisdom of his words hung in the air, offering not just forgiveness but an invitation to be part of something bigger than individual fears and prejudices, to be part of a community that grew stronger through understanding and acceptance. Watching her daughter happily drawing with Mr. Singh's son, Mrs. Lee felt a wave of shame wash over her. The weight of her earlier actions pressed heavily on her conscience as she observed the pure, uncomplicated friendship of the children, a stark contrast to her own prejudiced behavior. "I've been so wrong," she admitted, her voice cracking slightly. "I moved here thinking I needed to protect the neighborhood, but you've been protecting and nurturing it all along. I just couldn't see it." Around them, the party had taken on a different atmosphere. What had started as a celebration of one achievement had transformed into something more meaningful, a moment of community healing and understanding. Guests who had earlier been tense and guarded now relaxed, sharing stories and laughter. "You know," Mr. Singh said, refilling Mrs. Lee's glass with mango lassi, "when my family first moved here 15 years ago, we faced similar reactions. But one neighbor stood up for us, welcomed us, showed others that their fears were unfounded. That's why I believe in paying it forward." His wife added warmly, "That neighbor became one of our dearest friends. She passed away last year, but her kindness changed not just our lives, but the whole neighborhood's spirit." Mrs. Lee listened intently, noticing how many guests nodded in recognition of the story. She realized she was hearing not just about one family's journey, but about the very heart of what made a community strong. From the front yard came the sound of more children joining the chalk drawing session. Mrs. Lee's daughter was now teaching a small group how to create perspective in their artwork, her confidence growing with each explanation. "She's a natural teacher," Mr. Singh observed, "just like her mother must be." When Mrs. Lee looked surprised, he explained, "I read in her studio application that she learned art from you." That kind of passion usually runs in families. This simple observation, this recognition of her own contribution to the community through her daughter, brought fresh tears to Mrs. Lee's eyes. "I always wanted her to have opportunities I didn't have," she whispered. "I never thought." "That's exactly what every parent here wants," Mr. Singh's wife said gently. "It's what brings us together, despite our differences." The evening air was growing cooler, and someone turned on the patio heaters. The atmosphere had transformed from tense confrontation to something almost magical, strings of lights twinkling overhead, the smell of desserts wafting from the kitchen, and the sound of multi-generational conversations in various languages creating a symphony of community. Mrs. Lee watched as her daughter excitedly showed Mr. Singh her sketchbook, and he responded with genuine interest and encouragement. The same man she had tried to report hours earlier was now becoming her daughter's newest supporter. "The art fair next month," she said hesitantly, turning to Mr. Singh. "You really think my daughter should participate?" "Absolutely," he replied without hesitation. "In fact, I think both of you should help organize it. Your experience as an art teacher would be invaluable for the young artists." In that moment, Mrs. Lee realized she was being offered more than just forgiveness. She was being given a chance to be part of the community she had tried to reject. The transformation from outsider to potential contributor happened so naturally, so kindly that it took her breath away. As the sun set and the party lights twinkled brighter, the lessons of the day settled deep into everyone's hearts. They had witnessed not just the power of forgiveness, but the strength of a community that chose understanding over division, growth over stagnation, and love over fear. As the evening deepened, the BBQ celebration took on the warm glow of new beginnings. Mr. Singh stood up from the table and gently cleared his throat, drawing everyone's attention. "I think it's time for dessert," he announced, "but first, I'd like to share something special." His wife appeared with a large photo album, different from the one they'd looked at earlier. Opening it carefully, she revealed photographs from community events spanning over a decade. "Every year," she explained to Mrs. Lee, "we add more pages. Each photo tells a story of how our neighborhood has grown stronger together." The guests gathered around as Mr. Singh turned the pages, pointing out familiar faces and sharing memories. There were pictures of block parties, holiday celebrations, and community cleanup days. In many photos, faces showed the same transformation Mrs. Lee was experiencing now, from uncertainty to acceptance, from fear to friendship. "I remember this one," called out an elderly guest, pointing to a photo of a neighborhood Diwali celebration. "That was the first year the whole street participated. Now everyone looks forward to it." Mrs. Lee's daughter, still clutching her sketchbook, peered at the photos with growing excitement. "Mom, look," she exclaimed, pointing to a blank space on the current page. "We could put pictures from the art fair here." The simple observation from a child made several guests smile. Even Mrs. Lee found herself nodding, already imagining the possibilities. Her earlier prejudices seemed increasingly foolish in the face of such genuine community spirit. "You know," Mr. Singh said thoughtfully, "every person in these photos has their own story of how they found their place here. Some stories took longer than others, but each one made our community richer." A young couple who had been quietly observing spoke up. "When we moved in last year, we were worried about fitting in. But Mr. Singh and his family showed us that diversity isn't just accepted here, it's celebrated." Mrs. Lee listened to story after story, each one revealing another layer of the community she had so quickly judged. She watched as her daughter continued to draw with the other children, their laughter carrying across the yard in the cool evening air. "I have an idea," Mrs. Lee said suddenly, her voice stronger now. "For the art fair, what if we created a community mural? Something everyone could contribute to. The children could design it, and the adults could help paint." The suggestion was met with enthusiastic nods and immediately sparked discussion. Mr. Singh's wife brought out paper and pencils, and soon children and adults alike were sketching possible designs, their creativity unleashed by the simple power of working together. "See," Mr. Singh said quietly to Mrs. Lee, This is how communities grow. One idea, one connection, one shared moment at a time. The evening continued to unfold like a beautiful story, with people who had been strangers hours ago now planning future events together. Mrs. Lee's daughter had formed a small art club with several other children, while parents exchanged phone numbers and discussed carpooling arrangements. As plates of dessert were passed around, Mrs. Lee found herself deep in conversation with Mr. Singh's wife about traditional recipes and the possibility of starting a neighborhood cooking club. The transformation was so natural, so complete, that her earlier behavior felt like a distant memory. Sometimes, Mr. Singh observed, watching the scene with satisfaction, it takes a moment of conflict to show us what's really possible when we open our hearts to each other. The party had become more than just a celebration of academic achievement. It had become a testament to the power of community, understanding, and the simple act of choosing love over fear. As the evening stars began to twinkle above, matching the string lights below, the backyard hummed with the sound of new friendships being formed and old prejudices being left behind. In the weeks that followed the memorable BBQ, the neighborhood underwent a remarkable transformation. The story of what happened that evening spread from house to house, but not as a tale of conflict. Instead, it became a story of hope and change. Mrs. Lee threw herself into organizing the upcoming art fair with an enthusiasm that surprised everyone, including herself. The community mural project she had suggested became the centerpiece of the event, growing far beyond its original scope. Every weekend, neighbors would gather in the community center to plan and prepare. One sunny Saturday morning, as Mr. Singh arrived at the community center, he found Mrs. Lee already there, surrounded by color swatches and sketch proposals. "I never thought I'd say this," she admitted with a smile, "but this neighborhood has become more of a home in the past few weeks than it felt in all the months before." The children led the way in breaking down barriers. Mrs. Lee's daughter started an after-school art club, teaching other kids how to draw, while Mr. Singh's son helped with organizing the supplies. Their natural friendship inspired other parents to look past their own preconceptions and reach out to neighbors they had previously avoided. At the next city council meeting, Mrs. Lee stood up to speak. Her hands trembled slightly, but her voice was clear as she shared her story. "I came to this neighborhood thinking I needed to protect it," she said, "but what I really needed was to understand it. Thanks to one family's kindness in the face of my prejudice, I learned that true community strength comes from embracing our differences, not fearing them." The art fair, when it finally arrived, was a triumph of community spirit. The mural stretched across the community center wall, filled with images that represented every family's story. Children's artwork hung proudly alongside pieces by professional artists, and Mrs. Lee beamed as her daughter guided visitors through the exhibition. Mr. Singh watched it all with quiet satisfaction, remembering that tense afternoon at the BBQ that now felt like a lifetime ago. His wife stood beside him, serving her famous mango lassi to the art fair visitors, while their daughter, home from medical school for the weekend, helped younger students with their science homework in a quiet corner. The neighborhood newsletter, once filled with complaints about noise and parking, now overflowed with announcements of community events. Movie nights in the park, cultural food festivals, and weekly art classes brought people together who might never have spoken before. Mrs. Lee became one of the most active community organizers, using her experience to help other newcomers feel welcome. "Everyone deserves a second chance," she would say, "just like I got mine." The final piece of the community mural was added on a warm evening as the sun set. It was a simple symbol, a bridge connecting different parts of the artwork, suggested by one of the children. As neighbors gathered to celebrate its completion, Mr. Singh spoke softly to the group. "Look around," he said, gesturing to the diverse crowd of faces illuminated by the setting sun. "This is what community looks like. Not perfect, not without its challenges, but always growing, always learning, always making room for one more story." Mrs. Lee stepped forward, adding, "And sometimes the best stories start with a mistake, if we're brave enough to learn from it." The neighborhood had become a model for others in the city, proof that diversity wasn't just about tolerating differences, it was about celebrating them. The story of the BBQ that changed everything became part of the community's legend, retold at gatherings as a reminder that transformation is always possible when people choose understanding over fear. As the sun set on another community gathering, the laughter of children playing, The chatter of neighbors sharing stories and the simple joy of belonging filled the air. The neighborhood had discovered that the strongest communities aren't built with walls to keep people out, but with bridges to bring people together.